So if you look at the news or think about the major problems that we face, like climate change and, uh, you know, extreme inequality or democratic failure or backsliding, um, one of the impressions that you get is this that you have this dynamic where people, even though nominally there's lots of democracies throughout the world, it's people fighting against their governments, either to get the governments to do the things that they want, like in the case of climate action. Even in the US, a majority of people support more climate action. Um, or in the worst cases, resisting state violence against its own people or state repression. And of course, part of the explanation for this is that it's not just that the government is inherently bad, let's say, but there's also, powerful economic entities, fossil fuel companies, for example, that have an enormous influence on politics, but also the dissemination of information. So they have the ability to muddy the waters via misinformation that's been quite effective. Actually, the history is reminiscent of what the tobacco companies did. So given all of this, it's very reasonable, I think, to be cynical about government or about power generally. So I wanted to take an opportunity to talk a little bit about the philosophical position known as anarchism, because it is the most cynical with respect to government and or power. So anarchism is just the view that, and there's a lot of different versions, but basically the idea that there is no legitimate political authority. So there is no legitimate government. So they advocate for stateless societies, and quote unquote left anarchist positions have a more thoroughgoing critique of power and inequality altogether. So they are also not capitalists. They might reject all forms of hierarchy, for example. So highly egalitarian, stateless societies is what they might advocate for. So I thought it would be an interesting time to kind of talk through one of the sort of dialectics, the arguments between anarchists and non-anarchists, which concerns the question of social order, which is obviously a really basic question. Because, the obvious, if you teach political philosophy and you teach a section on anarchism, a typical reaction is like, okay, if there's no state and there's no law, like, what is that? Just chaos? Is it quote unquote anarchy, right? This is often the ordinary understanding of the word anarchy is just chaos. Now, that's not what anarchists advocate for. But there is this question, like, how is there any social order? Why would this be desirable at all? And often the line of thought just stops there. And I actually think I've been thinking about this recently, and there's really a lot of interesting questions here I thought it'd be worthwhile to go through. And one dynamic that I often see is this kind of push and pull between cynicism and optimism. So on the one hand, anarchists are often sort of the most cynical about the status quo because they have this really radical critique of, capitalism and government, right? So in that sense, it's really critical and cynical about the status quo compared to, more mainstream positions, which are like, hey, look, the basic systems are okay. We just need to, get some things right. On the other hand, anarchists, I think, are most often accused of being too optimistic. Not about the status quo, obviously, but about human nature, about what kinds of societies are possible or decent. Because sort of one of the driving justifications of government, in terms of popular justifications, but also in political philosophy is, well, people need to be kept in check somehow. Unlimited freedom for people would be a disaster because, we would do all kinds of terrible things to each other with nothing to keep us in check. Right. So that's this standard kind of argument. And before I launch into this, I just want to give one little disclaimer, which is about sort of how I conceive my role as a philosopher, either in the classroom or on this channel. And I just want to say, like, I'm not really interested in telling people what to believe. Really, like, my role, I think, as a philosopher is to challenge, right? And particularly to challenge, assumptions that we have. There's all sorts of things that we believe just because they've been repeated a lot of times or we never thought to question them. And the role of the philosopher is to bring those things to light and to pose some challenges to them. Something I always tell my students in any class that I teach is you shouldn't care what I think. And I think that's true. You should care about the reasons I have for what I believe or arguments I give as a rational person. But I just want to put that out there. So I kind of want to go through this exercise as an attempt to do that, to challenge the sort of, unquestioned assumptions that we have about social order. Okay, so I want to break this down like really slowly and simply, this kind of objection about social order, right? So what is the fundamental difference between anarchist views and other views that advocate for a government? Well, fundamentally, the question is like, does a decent society require that there be some people who have power over everyone else to boss them around, or to at least to be able to issue threats, to place limits on freedom and threats of violence? And this is what law is, right? Law is effectively a threat. If you do this thing, then there's going to be this penalty. And so you need some group of people who can A, determine what those rules are, hopefully democratically, and then B, have some people to enforce that, right? So you need some group of people who has the authority, or is given the authority, to use violence against other people in order to uphold the law, right? And so the anarchist says, well, either that's illegitimate, or well, we don't want that, we don't need that. And typically the person arguing against the anarchist says, no, you do need that. Without that, there's no possibility of social order, and it's chaos, and life is miserable, right? You get this sort of Hobbesian, Thomas Hobbes's picture of the state of nature as like sort of everyone at each other's throats, no one's safe. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. That's the famous line. So let's, again, go slow and go through this step by step. So why think that there would be chaos or, widespread rights violations, widespread harms, if there were no police or laws and law enforcement? And one thing we have to be clear about here is the question for the anarchist really is it possible to have a society like this? Not like, well, if we got rid of all the police tomorrow, would that be a good thing? Maybe there's some people who argue that, but that's really not the question, right? So the person arguing against the anarchist is usually saying like, well, what you're advocating for is basically impossible for human beings. So, right, what we're considering this hypothetical exercise of like, is it possible to have decent society in the absence of law and law enforcement? So why I think there would be chaos? Well, one possibility is that, you might think that, and this is, maybe the Hobbesian view, you might think that people are just inherently bad. People are inherently selfish. And so if they had the opportunity, they're going to take advantage of you, right? And so it's the deterrent effects of law and law enforcement that keep everyone in check. Now, I don't think this is the most plausible way to make this case, but I'm just putting it on the table as a possibility. Like, look, I live in a neighborhood with a lot of old people. They're a bunch of sweethearts, right? If for whatever reason, the local or national government collapsed, I don't think they're going to be trying to, all of a sudden, they're like, finally, and you have like some version of The Purge, Granny Edition, where they're trying to screw over their neighbors and like take their stuff or something like that. Like, I don't think that would happen. Most people are pretty decent, I would say, even in the absence of threats of coercion. Most people are horrified at the thought of, doing something that might make their neighbor feel bad about them. So I don't think that's the most plausible version. And I don't think the person who objects to anarchism has to be committed to that view of human nature. Probably the more plausible version is to say, well, it's not that most people are like that and you get like this purge situation. I never saw those movies, so I don't know if it was like everyone's like, haha, finally, or if it was some small group of people that were like, haha, finally. But so the other version is just like, look, most people are pretty good. They're not going to try to screw each other over. But there are some bad people, right? And it's those people that you have to be worried about. And without the threat of law enforcement, without the deterrent effect of law enforcement, then those people would sort of run amok and victimize everyone else, people who couldn't defend themselves. And that would be a bad thing, obviously. Now, one of the ways that the anarchists will usually respond here is to say, like, okay, but, you know, what are the primary causes of crime? You know, if you had a highly egalitarian society, for example, then a lot of the property crime that you see, you know, that's sort of chronic and systematic, you wouldn't expect in an anarchist society, because what would be the point? So, you know, one thing they'll say is like, look, in the society we're imagining, the social conditions and maybe the culture would be such that it would greatly reduce crime and victimization, right? Crime is sort of a legal notion, so just understand that as a sort of harms or rights violations. Now, that said, I think they still have to acknowledge that there could and would be some people who just do want to take advantage of other people for whatever reason, right? Or even people who aren't inherently bad, but you don't need people to be inherently bad for them to do bad things. And so, you know, maybe it would be really valuable to have this deterrent effect. So the picture you have now is like, look, this is why we need police, because there are going to be some quote unquote bad apples, and you have to protect everyone else who is not in a position to defend themselves from the bad apples. But there's really a lot of assumptions packed in here, which is kind of interesting. So, and they're sort of obvious, but they're worth teasing out. So like, one assumption is that police do or can adequately protect us. So I'm taking for granted that they're bad apples, but now we're asking, okay, like, how do police help? So that's assumption number one. The second assumption, which is more challenging, I think, is that communities cannot protect themselves, or at least not as well, without police, right? It's worth noting, and I don't know the history super well here, but, you know, professional police forces are a pretty recent kind of thing. So like throughout most of human history, you didn't have this. But, you know, the communities need some way of protecting themselves and monitoring behavior and doing things like that. And it could be that having police just do a much better job. And then the third assumption, which is the most interesting one, perhaps, in light of human history and also current events, is that police don't pose a significant threat to the good apples, or the good guys themselves, right? I think also you should throw in here the cost of the harms of criminal punishment too, right? Especially in societies, let's say in the US, where like the punishments are not just about deterrence. There's been some research on this. The last I've heard, you know, something like having more harsh prison sentences beyond 10 or 20 years, you don't get any additional deterrent effects. Then there's also the nature of the prisons themselves, right? So that is, I mean, typically people just disregard that. I mean, it's actually wild to me, right? Like at the same time, people are like, yeah, human rights are good. But then if anyone has done anything criminal, if anyone is a criminal, then, you know, people tend to think that they just don't count anymore. That's kind of wild to me. You know, if you're accepting some kind of broadly liberal human rights view. Anyways, so I want to just go through these assumptions a little bit. And again, my goal is not to kind of settle these empirically. These are, you know, complicated empirical questions that I don't have the answers to in a lot of cases. But it's worth, even from the armchair, just breaking down the different sort of requirements for the argument to work. And by the way, Bertrand Russell, the famous philosopher, is someone who's made a kind of version of this argument. So he's someone I have in the background. In some ways, he's very sympathetic to anarchism, but it's sort of the typical, like, well, that would be nice, but I just don't see how you can have it kind of thing. So first question is, how well do police deter crime? And that's actually a really interesting question. So first, you know, if all you do is watch superhero cartoons, you think of like the role of police as like preventing crime before as it happens. That's usually what superheroes are involved in. And that does happen sometimes, but most of the time that's not the case, right? So like, you know, like even murders, in a lot of cases they're spur of the moment kinds of things. Property theft, you know, it's rarely stopped in the sort of in the act or beforehand. So mostly the effect of crime reduction is not prevention per se, but deterrence, trying to discourage people from trying in the first place. Now, this is interesting, right? Like, for anyone who lives in a city in the US, for example, you can look up this tool. I think it's called Crime Mapper, crime mapping, where it shows like all of the reported crimes of various sorts in the city in a given period in the past day or in the past week. And one of the things that you find is that like property crime is rampant. So I lived in a US city once which was a perfectly fine city. But it was basically expected that, any car on this side of the street would be sort of gone through, passed over, maybe even nightly, but on a regular basis. And so the recommendation was that, number one, don't have anything valuable or don't store a gun like in the car where it can be seen or in general. But also leave your windows open because you want people to be able to look in and see that there's nothing there rather than smashing the window and then finding out there's nothing there, right? If that's the advice, this is indicative of a situation where, the police can't or plausibly can't do much to stop this. I also highly doubt they're kind of following up and tracking down people when you have some cash stolen or something like that. So I do just want to point out that, like, at least in a lot of cases, there's a lot of crime that's just going to fall through the cracks, and that's to be expected. So we shouldn't overstate the ability of police to deter crime. And of course, this is a case where, it's difficult to have like experimental controls because we don't have a lot of instances where, the police are just absent to compare against. Now, there are cases where that happens, and I do want to stop people here because I can imagine, there's some historically inclined people who are like, don't you know about the time when, the government collapsed and there was no police and it was chaos? Yes. Right. So don't make the mistake of pointing to an instance where things have gone terribly wrong. We can also point to cases of governments, plenty of them, where things have gone terribly wrong, right? Again, the question is like, is it possible to have social order in the absence of law and law enforcement? So to point to a case where it failed is just sort of beside the point. Now, I actually want to bring up a point that Bertrand Russell makes in this piece where he's criticizing anarchism. As I said, he has some sympathy with the arguments. And one of the things that he points out is like, look, it's funny when we think about crime, we think about homicide, assault, rape, property crime, by and large. We often ignore sort of more systemic or quote unquote white collar crime, which in many cases is much more significant in terms of the harm that it does to people or communities. For example, like this isn't even crime per se, but like the harm that like the tobacco companies or fossil fuel companies did by basically creating propaganda to make people confused about the issue. I mean, it's hard to overstate the costs of that. Not to mention like unpunished environmental disasters and other things and large scale cases of fraud. Like these are incredibly harmful things, which often aren't effectively punished or deterred. So it's a question of, does law adequately deter in all domains, and which ones is it effective and which ones is it less effective? Just raising that example. So let's suppose there is a deterrent effect, right? Law and law enforcement makes it the case that there's fewer rights violations, let's say, than there otherwise would be. So the second assumption was this question of, well, can communities do this without a police force? So without a set of people who, again, have the special authority to use violence against other people. And the answer is that, of course, they can. But how effective is it, and how ugly is it, right? So, like, what you might have in mind is like, well, look, if there's no police and legal system, then, you have vigilante justice or mob justice, and that's pretty bad, pretty ugly. Fair. So the question is whether there's other ways that it can be dealt with. So in the history of, let's say, egalitarian, anarchist, hunter-gatherer societies, in a lot of cases it was sort of social order is done through social norms and then like shunning if someone starts acting badly and things like that. So all these various social pressures which you can employ to kind of inhibit bad behavior. I think that the Amish do some kind of internal thing like that as well. I don't remember the details of this. An interesting case that I really enjoy is the case of the Wendat. So this is a Native American Indian group in the northeastern U.S. and Canada, those woodlands. And I think it was Jesuit missionaries, when they encountered them, they were there was always this interesting dynamic where the Europeans were like kind of shocked at the amount of freedom and, lawlessness of these groups. And so they had an interesting way of dealing with like homicide, for example. So if a member of one group or tribe, let's say, murdered someone from another tribe, what would happen is there was an expectation that the tribe or family from the offending party would offer massive amounts of compensation to the victim's family or tribe. I'm forgetting sort of the level of the group here. And the point was kind of like, if you don't do this, then, you're going to expose yourself to revenge killings. And that's bad. And so when theorists often think of this kind of dynamic, thinking like people like Thomas Hobbes or even Robert Nozick, when he's thinking about the state of nature, there's this concern that like, look, someone does something bad to someone else, maybe, they murder someone, that group is going to be furious and they're going to come back and exact revenge. And then there's going to have this endless escalating cycle. But that's actually not how it has to go. So again, for the Wendat, they had this practice of offering massive amounts of compensation, because again, if you don't do that, you do open yourself to a kind of like revenge killings, right? And people don't want that. Now, you might say, well, this isn't an effective deterrent at all, because like if I can get away with murder and it's just my family and friends that have to pay for it, like why is that such a big deal for me? That's an interesting that people will reason that way in the first place. Like, everyone just wants to get away with murder. No, they don't. But actually the idea is that this is a really effective deterrent. Why? Because the last thing you want to do, especially if it's a small and tight-knit community, is to screw over all of your friends and family and bring shame on yourself and them, right? So it's not that it doesn't happen, but this is a different way to engage in deterrence, which is, I just bring that up as an interesting example. And one of the things that you see from reading this stuff, like the history of egalitarian groups, for instance, is that there's a lot of creativity in just different ways to tackle these social problems. And we don't really have a great imagination for these days for different ways of doing things. Okay, so I just leave that as an open question. Could communities without police engage in effective deterrence? Perhaps. And then the question is like, well, in what circumstances? Like, what kinds of cultural requirements do you need? Or like, maybe it's impossible with the scale of our current world, or something about the technology. These are common things people say. Open question, right? Interesting question. So then the third question, or the last assumption, is the question of, well, what about the threats that police pose themselves to the good guys, to the good people, right? And again, so the concern is just going to be, look, and certainly an anarchist will be sympathetic to this, but everyone should be a little bit worried, always worried, about giving certain people power over other people and giving them license to use violence. Now, license to use violence it's supposed to be within pretty strict bounds to enforce the laws, but we just know that it's a risky thing to do, to give people that kind of power. And of course, you can do things to make it go better or worse, but the thought is, there's always that concern there that opens up the possibility of corruption and abuse and so on. And of course, if you look at the track record of police, there's a lot of this, right? Like there's a lot of abuse. Obviously, there's well-known cases of police brutality, or well-known patterns of police brutality. But also just things like theft. Like police also engage in a lot of theft. There's a lot of that kind of abuse and corruption too. And there's probably reason to think that it's underreported given their position in the law enforcement and sort of legal discovery process, right? They have the ability to kind of suppress very often investigation and prosecution. So given that, I mean, I find it kind of interesting, right, how quickly when we say like, well, of course, social order requires police because we have to protect against these bad guys, why we're so quick to think that, like, why do we trust the police more? And I think there's reasons for this. Like, number one, we're like, okay, you can't just like declare yourself a member of the police. There's training, there's institutional hoops that you have to jump through, which are meant to ensure that you're the right kind of person, you get the right kind of training, and that's going to, prevent the most egregious abuses. On the other hand, we know that those methods are highly imperfect. Could they be better? Absolutely, right? So like, the anarchist can't just say, well, look how bad the police are actually, so police are necessarily bad. It's the same kind of mistake that their opponent was making. Like, so the question is like, how maybe instead what we should do is do policing better, right? But they're going to be more cynical about human beings in positions of power and be like, I think that's doomed. Whereas the other side is going to be like, well, I think not having them is doomed, right? So again, I think, we're like, okay, well, we have some control over what the police are like via these like training and selection processes, and they're also bound by the law, even though it does that imperfectly. But then you could push back and be like, well, why are you so confident that, I mean, can't those selection processes and training processes also be taken over and corrupted by the political authorities, right? Like, it also requires that we trust them, and they're also people with positions of power. They're not the ones who have the license to use violence, but they direct the people who use violence, right? And fair enough, right? A lot of times they're not particularly trustworthy. But then you're like, okay, well, this is where the process of democracy should help. They need to be accountable to the people and so on, and the people choose them. So it's interesting, in this really roundabout way, you get around to the position where it is people, communities protecting themselves, either by in the anarchist case, not having police in the first place and organizing their affairs, or in the democratic case, through this process of having political representatives, which then, have police and things to engage in law enforcement. But ultimately, this sort of political check by the people will do it. And we know that that's also imperfect for a lot of the reasons that we've described. Now, the other thing that the police introduce is, even when policing is going well, let's say, and a democracy is going well, there's always a chance that they don't, or that things turn south, right? And when a really bad person takes control of political power, the police or any kind of militarized group are the primary mechanism which they can use to terrorize or tyrannize their constituents. And again, like, these kinds of cases, this is exceptionally common throughout human history, right? So, the anarchists can point to this and say, look, even when things are going well, you got to be careful, because they won't necessarily be going well forever. And this is, things libertarians have sort of said for ages too. Or even, Second Amendment enthusiasts, same kind of thing. So certainly there's no guarantee, and there's really substantial risks that are introduced by having a police force. So it's really a mess, no matter what, right? Like there's this illusion. I think there's a passage in Kant where he argues that you need to have a state to be sort of guaranteed of your property rights, or to feel like to actually have property rights. You need sort of these guarantees. There's no guarantees. Ain't no guarantees, no matter what. So the comparison then is a really complicated one. It's not even just, in the anarchist society, we're imagining like, well, what are the bad people left unchecked going to do? Can the community deal with that in various ways? Versus, what are the threats and harms that introducing police adds? what you have to compare is like, or what you would have to compare if you're like, which would be preferable, all things considered, which is, an impossible, underspecified thought experiment. You're like, okay, you've got whatever harms that bad people are going to commit in the anarchist society, plus the harms introduced by whatever the community methods are for dealing with this. Again, there's concerns about mob justice or vigilante justice, plus the harms of whatever the punishment mechanisms are. Versus in the police case, you've got the bad people and the harms that they're going to do, plus the additional threats or risks that come with having a group of people that have extra power and extra license to use violence, plus the risks of potential tyranny if the wrong people get control of those groups, plus the harms of punishment and things like that. So this is really complicated. And that's really all I wanted to point out. So I just, the main things are that A, it's complicated, and B, I think it's interesting how quick we are to sort of just trust that putting a uniform on people and giving them this extra authority is inherently necessarily going to make things better. Empirically, I don't know how you establish that. Again, it's going to depend on a lot of different factors, but it kind of reflects to me this interesting dynamic of, are you optimistic or cynical about people? And are you optimistic or cynical about power? Right? Most people are some combination of the two. Anarchists are very strongly in the optimistic about people and cynical about power. But yeah. So if I'm right that it is complicated, at least, I mean, I hope I at least raise some interesting questions or challenges for anyone. And if it's complicated, then that's interesting, right? That's progress. That's something new to have to think about, new things to question. And in the end, isn't that what we need? More questions. See you next time.